I hope you agree with me. I hope you agree with me that this morning we had an excellent kick-off discussion on the larger opportunities of Germany and Australia to work together. Now, in the next sessions, we are also going a little bit more into the nitty-gritty detail. And some of us, and some of the speakers here on the podium will also have been working at the bleeding edge of the transition. For example, we have South Australia here on the podium, and you will hear also about the challenges that need to be addressed to make that transition a success. So the next session is moderated by Wolf-Peter Schill. Wolf-Peter Schill is the Deputy Head of the Department of Energy, Transportation and Environment at the German Institute for Economic Research at the DIW Berlin. He there has the expertise in power market modeling, renewable energy integration, energy storage, and different sector coupling strategies. Wolf-Peter Schill is also the lead architect of several open source models, for example, DETA, that is also used here in the Australian context, thanks to the open source connected world. So please join me in welcoming Wolf-Peter Schill, who will introduce then the speakers of the next session.
So thank you very much, Malte. Does this work? Yes. So thank you very much for the really kind introduction, and thanks for preparing this wonderful event. So this session is on flexibility options. I'm actually not sure if this is really proper English, but we Germans keep talking about Flexibilitätsoptionen, so that would be the direct translation. And this is the plan for this session. So first I'll give a brief introduction and overview, and then we'll have 5 distinguished speakers sharing specific views on particular aspects of in particular distributed flexibility options. And then we'll catch up a bit here on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. And actually, can I click through my slides, or will you? Here it is. Perfect. And I have to, will it work? So that's me. Here. So let's start with this picture. It's related to the one that Frank already showed this morning. This is something I just quickly put together as the kind of background of the situation. So you see, this is the renewable share in electricity in our both countries. And as we've learned, Germany is now around 40%. And you see large of this, the greenish and the yellow is actually variable renewables. And if you see that, you can imagine that for the last 20 years, there has already been quite a bit of discussion about flexibility options and about integrating these into the grid. Oh, now it's gone. We don't want to hide anything. That means we're looking a bit back into the debate, and then in the end we look ahead. And I must also say, I think it was very valuable what has been said in the first session. Germany heavily benefited from a largely stable and very capable transmission grid, and from the European interconnection when we integrated these renewables. So, and I'm not perfectly sure what Mr. Herdan said, that we could do this without major problems. I think there have been several things done in actually to make this integration of renewables so smooth so far. That was the wrong button. I pressed the same one as before. I'm sorry. Yes. So why are we talking about flexibility? Well, that is obviously due to the nature of variable renewable energy resources. And they come with particular properties, and I guess most of you are well aware. They have specific temporal properties. So first, their availability is depending on time and on weather. And on top of that, there's another temporal property that actual generation may deviate from short-term forecasts. And then there's also a spatial property. So good renewable resources are generally not located such that they correspond to the historic grid setup. And these properties then obviously give rise to different dimensions of flexibility that have to be addressed. I'm still struggling with, can you tell me in which direction I have to put this? Oh, there it is. But Cheng, is it to you? Okay, thanks. So dimensions of flexibility. So the first and maybe the most important one is what we call residual load smoothing, or I think in Australia you say net load smoothing, and maybe people get a better grip on this energy arbitrage definition. And the second one would then be for the short-term fluctuations to do real-time balancing and all kinds of other ancillary services, we've heard a bit of that before in the session. And there is a need for spatial balancing. Oh, and the mic is on again. And you have seen many illustrations like this before. Just to give a bit of background, this is just one simulation for Germany to illustrate it. You have diurnal fluctuations of PV and more irregular and longer-term fluctuations of wind power. And you see both don't perfectly match to the historic electric load. So that is this dimension of flexibility, particularly this residual load balancing that I mentioned. And then you can actually think about what options are there for providing this flexibility. And this is a categorization I've done a few years ago, and I think it's generally still useful. And I'm afraid that although we trained it, really did a rehearsal on this, that the slide again is somehow corrupted, but we'll see. So you have several categories like power storage, generation side options, the demand side options that we already discussed a bit today. Then you have what I call new and flexible load and several grid-related options. And there is also another way of thinking about this. Oh, did it work? There should be something popping up. I'm sorry, the technology is letting me down. I did this nice presentation with lots of illustrations, but okay, I'll talk. It also works without slides. So you can, we Germans like to put English terms or use English words for stuff. So you can actually categorize many of these power storage options as power to power, so power in, power out. But it's not only strictly the power storage options, but for example, indirect water storage, that means an adjusted management of hydro reservoirs that also has the same effect in the power system as power storage. And the same is true for load shifting. If you shift electric load from one time to the other, that has the same function as power storage in the power system. So that you could group that as power to power. And then you have situations you could call X to power, so you take some form of energy and generate power when you need it, and that's obviously, for example, the dispatchable conventional plants that need to be replaced, we heard in this morning, but also load curtailment, so not consuming at some point has the same effect. And then you have one of the big buzzwords, at least in Germany, you have power to X, and we call this also sector coupling, power to X in a wider sense. You take power and you transfer it to other sectors that are not electrified yet. So power to heat, power to gas, and different kinds of power to mobility. And obviously hydrogen also plays a role there. So these are all flexibility options. And so that even worked without, without the nice slide animations I did. So, and how do these work in the system? Well, then obviously you have the power-to-power options. This is the same 2-week example as before, and the gray area is the residual load that actually has to be met. So you can use any kind of power-to-power option to actually smooth this residual load pattern. And you can make also use of this power-to-power option to integrate renewable surpluses. That would be if the residual load gets negative. But you could also make use of this and transfer it to other sectors, so you don't have to actually integrate renewable surpluses by means of, for example, storage, power storage. You can also use them elsewhere. And obviously this area C here, that would be the X to power category, like generating dispatchable power whenever you need it. Okay. At least that keeps all of us awake, I guess. There should be more slides. No? Otherwise, I just... there it is. So while we have seen a lot of research and discussion about kind of central flexibility options, for example, large-scale or utility-scale power storage. We also have worked a lot on that. Today we want to look a bit more ahead and talk about distributed flexibility options, or I would probably say potential distributed flexibility options. And there are many examples. There is the charging and potentially also the discharging of electric vehicle batteries. And there is load shifting in a whole range of commercial and potentially also residential applications. And we have PV battery systems. And this is something that is relatively similar in both countries, that we have this boom in PV battery systems. So in Germany, we now have more than 120,000 PV battery systems. And I think the overall capacity of these batteries just exceeded the 1 gigawatt hour mark. So it's still small compared to pumped hydro, but it's a sizable market by now. And I couldn't get the real numbers on Australia, but everything I've seen is that the development is, in relative terms, even faster than in Germany when it comes to these PV battery systems. But quite often, at least that's the case for Germany today, there are often no incentives or even no possibility for these distributed options to actually provide their flexibility in a system or market-oriented way. And that is why I would like to kick off the discussion with this statement. So there was an inspiring quote template slide, and I'm not sure if it's inspiring, but it's a quote, and I would say there is no shortage of potential distributed flexibility options, but certainly there are barriers to their implementation. And that is what I would like to discuss today. And so hopefully with less technical problems, we will now start with our first speaker, which is Mr. Paul-Georg Gaumer. He's from TenneT TSO in Germany. So TenneT is one of the 4 TSOs in Germany, and they are really active in integrating renewables. And usually you hear people from TenneT talking about grid expansion and what they do to make the transmission grid stronger. But today we have a bit of an exception, and he will talk about actually the use of distributed flexibility sources and the benefits they could bring to the transmission grid. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Wolf. Okay, so we have a bit of a learning curve, and we try this side. And I've also learned these problems derive from cable problems, and that's a very familiar problem we know as a TSO. This morning also someone else, Wolf, asked me that he was very surprised that I would not talk about grid expansion today, but about flexibility options. But actually, I intended to make one remark on grid expansion, and that is very important, not least because my regulator is sitting there, and he's sort of expecting this from me, because grid expansion in Germany which is laid down in the grid extension plan for the next 10 years, is absolutely necessary despite the flexibility options we explore in our pilot projects. So what I will briefly show you in the coming minutes is really something we explore as pilot projects to have it in place in about 10 years' time. But up to 2030 and maybe beyond, we need to build all the projects which are laid down also in the German law and which we are anyhow obliged to build. And I hope, Jochen Hohmann, you are now satisfied with that remark. And that's, by the way, a huge pipeline. For TenneT alone, it's at the moment 35 billion euros. That's for all Netherlands and Germany, part of Germany where we are active. But for Germany alone, it's 23 billion, and that's only the official figure. Jochen Hohmann is putting even more projects on that pipeline, so it will be even more billions that will have to be spent, and that's only for TenneT. We have 3 other TSOs, and so you can see the vast amount of grid expansion needed in Germany. And that leads me to another remark to which I was brought by the discussion this morning, because this grid expansion, first of all, has very great challenges, and I'm not going to repeat the scarce locations we still have in the densely populated country of Germany, not only to build windmills and other installations, but also to build grids. That's only one point, and so that the acceptance for new grids is a very big topic in Germany, of course, but also running the current grid with a share of more than 40% renewables is also a big challenge. And there was some remarks alluding to the fact that everything is easygoing with 40% renewables in the German grid. Well, it's still reliable, and my colleagues and me are very proud of the high reliability of our grid, but it takes a lot of additional work. And to give you one example before I come to our very interesting and fascinating pilot projects, to give you one example of the challenge we have to keep our grid stable with all the distributed renewables, is that some 10 years ago, we had, as TenneT, and it was similar with the other German TSOs, we had to interfere with the grid about 3 times a year. So for all the rest of the year, we could let the system run, and the relationship between production and demand was simply running smoothly without our people in the redispatch center doing anything. Now it's not 3 times, but 4 to 5 times a day. And every day of the year now, we have to control the system and interfere with the system as a TSO. So it is really a high effort we have to do to keep the system stable. But we have managed up to now, and I'm quite optimistic that we manage to do it in the future. But it will take additional decisions, and it will need additional technologies. And that's why we are exploring distributed flexibility, because we believe that in about 10 years' time, and some years on top, the grid extension will one way or the other come to an end. First of all, we are, as you might know, currently busy, especially TenneT, with building very large electricity highways in HVDC technology. And these highways are heavily disputed. Again, it comes to the matter of acceptance. And we believe we will build these highways, and we are just about to get the first put it pre-licenses by the regulator to really go into the concrete planning of the routing. And so we are really quite optimistic that we will build these highways. But we are also sure that that from the point of acceptance alone, there will be a point after 2030 where we will not get any additional of these highways. And that's one of the reasons that we believe we need to explore distributed flexibility also as a TSO, as a transmission system operator. That will be necessary anyhow, because we will have less and less, and we have heard all this morning, less and less central power stations. We will have more and more distributed production facilities spread all around the country on different places than we have the central power stations now. And that is, for instance, cars, of course. As you also might know, and that's part of the difficult story of energy transition also in Germany, as you might know, we will fail to reach our goal of 1 million electric vehicles next year. That was originally set up by the government, but it will not be reached. I don't know, we have maybe not even 10% of that amount of electric vehicles at the moment. And so, yeah, it will take more time, but we are sure we will get electric vehicles at least as a part of the entire fleet. I'm not going into the discussion what role hydrogen might play in the transport sector, but we will get a vast amount of electric vehicles. We are sure of that, and that's why we are exploring to use these electric vehicles as a flexibility option, also for stabilizing the grid. And the same goes, of course, for battery storage capacity. And I will come to a concrete pilot project with the company of Sonnen. And we have also one representative of the company Sonnen here in the room. But what we also use is, and we had the topic of energy forecasting. Forecasting the future, we have heard, is quite difficult, as always. And that's another thing we want to use in the future, and that is forecasting the local weather. Because at the moment, local weather is not known anyhow. You have a couple of metering stations spread around the country, but local weather is not known at all. And, but it would be very interesting for us to know the local weather, to know whether some clouds, in which minute they exactly will cover large production capacities of solar, and then we can adapt our control power we need, and that saves money, and it will save CO2. So we are doing that with cars. Because, as you know, the usual car has many sensors for humidity, for light, and for the temperature. And we can make use of these sensors, and it really works. I can tell you, we are working together with Volkswagen and with BMW and others. And it really works that we get all the data, and if you happen to drive around Munich with a lease car of BMW, we get your data. You don't know it, but we get it. And in the future, when we have access to all the data of many cars driving around in Germany, we will have the local weather, and we can adapt the control power. And I mentioned the company of Sonnen. There's the cable failure again, but I learned, keep talking. With Sonnen, it's not cars, it's not vehicles, but it's solar plus battery for households. And that is really very interesting. And just the other week, with the managing director of Sonnen, Mr. Kornefeld, I opened the 500th, or I welcomed the 500th member of our solar society. And it's not that Sonnen only has 500 systems in Germany. I think it's more than 20,000. Correct me if I'm wrong. but it's 500 which are in this solar or energy society, which we then use, connecting them via blockchain to use it as a sort of a virtual power plant, again to derive control power and to stabilize the grid. Again, it's a pilot, yeah, but we will roll it out. I'm very optimistic, and in the future we'll also can use it to stabilize the grid. As you can see there, as you could have seen there, we use IBM blockchain for that, and so that is really absolutely fascinating. It works, and it's really something which we will have in place, I'm sure, in about a couple of years, at least 10 years' time, and so it's a proven project. And that is, again, the cars. I'm not going to read out everything of that, but it's interesting to know that we are working with all sorts of cars. We have Teslas in the Netherlands, and the people driving these Teslas get more than 200 euros a year, at least, for giving us the opportunity to stop charging, because it cannot be done bi-directional, but at least we can stop charging and thereby stabilize the grid. And we are working together with Nissan and other car companies. I hope, well, the 5 minutes are maybe already over, so I rushed through our really fascinating pilot projects. We have, by the way, many more, and let me conclude by saying, if you happen to be, for instance, in Berlin, we have a really very impressive showroom there where we show many more examples which we will use in the future, but for the time being, grid expansion is what we need to do. And, but still today I'm happy to talk maybe more about our flexibility pilot projects. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Paul. So for the sake of the 5 minutes, I shouldn't have triggered you talking about transmission expansion, but that was fine. And I also realized that probably a more catchy headline for the session would have been distributed flexibility resources, we get your data. So, next we have Vince Duffy with us. So Vince is the Executive Director of the Department for Energy and Mining in South Australia. And he's an expert on regulatory and market reform. And I was just saying, please, I guess South Australia is the Denmark of Europe when it comes to renewable penetration, but I learned it's the Denmark with weak grids. So we're happy to learn from your experience in Australia with distributed resources. Please.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to come. I was in a delegation that went to Germany with Malte last year, and I had a very interesting learning about the energy vendor and how important it is to have that bipartisan support for going forward. I think that's the lesson I took out of the exchange. But on flexibility mechanisms, South Australia, they were talking this morning about our experience of integrating renewables into weak grids. That was actually just code for South Australia. We have a relatively small system, a peak demand of 3,300 megawatts in summer and an average demand of 1,500 megawatts. And Okay. I was hoping to sit down, but no, it's all right. So our transition, I've been trying to find a way to talk about how we are transitioning in South Australia and whether we've already gone beyond the tipping point and have the next stage of transitioned, because in 2000 we had one small wind farm up in Cooperpedia, 150 kilowatts, and we now have around 2,000 megawatts of grid-scale renewables connected to South Australia. And the next slide, and about 50% of our energy from renewable sources in production, increasing, currently expected to increase to about 66%. And the government has an ambition by the 30s to have net 100% renewables in South Australia. So still very committed towards going on, and the uptake of distributed resources in South Australia has been outstanding. So you can see boom to 1,000 megawatts. So we've got a gigawatt of rooftop solar in South Australia now. You can see the ramp up in it, and the area that is really expanding now is larger systems in commercial and industrial customers are really adopting it. So we've 1,000 megawatts. I think we're about 1.1 gigawatts now in rooftop solar in South Australia, and that growth continues unabated. And if you think about South Australia, the numbers that we had, our biggest power station in South Australia was a 1,280 megawatt thermal gas power station. And so we're nearly, rooftop solar is equivalent in capacity terms at least to our largest power station in South Australia. So you can see that uptake mainly in the household early on, but the grid, the C&I stuff is what's really expanding, and also things that go up to about 5 megawatts in the distribution system. 4.9 actually, because the regulatory framework for national market has a 5 megawatt cutover where you have to be registered with AEMO, so we're getting a lot of 4.9 megawatt systems built. So looking forward, you can see the growth continuing. So this is based upon AEMO's forecasts on uptake going forward. And even when you look, the 1 gigawatt that's equivalent to what the previous slide was, you can see that's still doubling by 2030. So we'll have 2 gigawatts of solar on rooftops. And the lower blue and green lines are the forecasts of battery uptake. We've had a relatively late start-up on household battery uptake, but the government has a couple of programs in place that have been put in by our current government and the former government. There was a Tesla VPP program that the first 2 phases are now largely implemented, which have 1,100 batteries installed in housing trust or housing commission homes. And then the government has a target for 40,000 batteries, which they've put $100 million in for residential batteries to be installed. Currently, we've had about 2,700 or 2,800 approved for installation. So we then have the AGL VPP, which had 1,000 batteries. Simply Energy has a VPP, which I haven't got the number on the top of my head. And SA Power Networks put 100 batteries in for a distribution trial. So the uptake of batteries has been impressive, and if those VPPs with Tesla and the government's home battery, we'd see 100,000 batteries installed in South Australia on households within a few years. So that is, in terms of uptake of distributed resources, quite impressive. I think people were talking about what are the implications of this sort of uptake of distributed resources on demand. And so here's the evolving duck curve in South Australia. So this is the average demand profile in South Australia, and you can see in, I think it's 2010, it's a fairly traditional standard. You had a very low overnight demand at 3 in the morning sort of thing, and then it ramped up as people got up in the morning, continued to grow over the day, and our peak was somewhere around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. What's happened, and then you can see a very sharp uptake at midnight, which is the hot water load coming on. But as you see the penetration of PV going into the system, you see the duck evolving. And I've been told the duck is, if you look at the curve at the bottom, that's seen as the shape of a duck as it's in the water. So that's what the duck part is. But we've looked at the forecasts for what AEMO's predicting in uptake going forward, and this is an AEMO graph, and the next one is also an AEMO graph, which I'm calling the swan curve, which is, you can see the uptake where the black line across is no net demand from the South Australian grid, with it all being met by renewable, or by PV on rooftops, in fact. And then below that, having to be able to export it to keep the system in balance. And if you look down the bottom of the thing, it's getting towards 600 megawatts, or it's a bit below 600 megawatts by 2035, I think it is on the graph. And that's actually the total available capacity of our interconnection with the rest of the NEM at the moment. So beyond meeting all of South Australia's demand, by that, on those forecasts, we will have reached the extent of our ability to export as well. So one of our key projects in South Australia is also a grid expansion to connect South Australia directly to New South Wales, all the way to Wagga. It's a $1.5 billion project currently in the regulatory approval process. So Jim's looking at it carefully at the moment, and he's going to give it a nice stamp of approval very shortly. So I'm very optimistic of that anyway. So I've been asked, because of my 5 minutes, that was the sort of extent. I've got a few more slides if people ask some questions later on, but that's all I was going to go into. But you can see South Australia as an extreme case. The Australian, Matthew Warren keeps calling us the accidental experiment, but it actually wasn't an experiment. The government came in 2002 with a very clear objective to make a substantial contribution and commitment towards addressing climate change and taking real action. And with the renewable energy target, which is a Commonwealth program, allowed renewable generation to be located anywhere in Australia to create credits for that program. And South Australia got more than its fair share. And it had a couple of primary reasons. One, had fantastic resources and still has fantastic resources. There's some number like 17 gigawatts of rooftop solar could be installed. There's enough roof capacity in South Australia to put that sort of number in. We had a very extensive transmission network, and a low population density. So the density of NIMBYs is fairly low, and so we could actually get projects up largely through councils for wind farms. So there was a low NIMBY ratio. And then we had a government that was fully supportive and put in planning amendments to an Investment-Friendly Development Act that meant that investors could invest with some certainty without having merits reviews of independent planning commissions. So having that factor, and the one that always surprises me is the support of government is seen to be so important for investors that the government is behind the program. And I can say going forward, the government still continues to be supportive of fair adaptation towards climate goals. So while it's controversial across Australia, it is less controversial in South Australia. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince. Just a fun fact, what you call the swan curve, a hub researcher sitting here has called this the seagull curve. And just to do a bit of advertisement, so that there is now a German Energy Transition Hub Twitter account, and there you can find a really nice illustration of that too. So the next speaker that will try to stick to the 5 minutes is Benedikt Deuchert. He's with Entelios, that is a large demand response company, or aggregator, as we probably say in Germany. And he can give us an insight on the opportunities for and challenges of demand response in Germany and about the demand response landscape. So happy to have you here, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So one just brief introduction. I will really try to stick to the 5 minutes. Entelios, as you said, is a demand response aggregator. The company was the first company to get loads into automated ancillary services in the German grid. That was in 2013, and it has operated demand response pools for ancillary services ever since, 24/7, and is operational today with a pre-qualified amount of in excess of 1 gigawatt in Germany. Yeah, so I'll really just want to give you some concrete hands-on experience on what can be done with commercial industrial demand response nowadays on a commercial basis. This is important. So I'm not going to talk about pilot projects, but about stuff that's really happening and that is for us profitable business indeed. So, okay. Just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude, I continue talking. What you would see on the left-hand side is a pumped hydro power plant, some of which are operational in Germany to provide flexibility. This is This is a relatively old one, so using the turbines to switch the energy levels from low to high and vice versa. And we claim we can do the same quality with loads, indeed. So this is an example. This is a paper mill. So what's happening there, there's a grinder converting wood into pulp. Pulp is a basis material for paper production. And you could imagine the energy levels just like in the example of the pumped hydro. So you have a pile of wood on the one side and a pile of pulp on the other side, which would translate to the lower and the higher energy level on the pumped hydro plant. And you see that in a specific example I chose here, we're talking about roughly 20 megawatts that are needed to operate this grinder. And depending on the storage levels of the pile of wood and the pile of pulp, this process might be interrupted for about 10 hours, giving you 200 megawatt hours of storage capacity. Of course, the prerequisite is that operational processes allow this, that the paper production that comes afterwards is not affected. So what we do then is getting lots of these assets into our system to ensure that the amount of flexibility we promise to the TSO to stabilize the grid, so that Mr. Garmer is happy, is always available. This is another example. This is an aluminum furnace. And we can use the thermal capacity in the aluminum smelter also for flexibility. And it's actually possible. This one company here, you see here, it's called Trimet. It's the largest producer of aluminum in Germany, and it is about 2% of the entire power consumption in Germany. So it's quite significant. And the entire production of this company can be switched off, actually, which is also done from time to time if the grid is in the respective condition that requires so. Okay, so this is some general examples where Entelios has managed to onboard flexibility into the virtual power plant. It is primarily a very energy-intense industry. You might wonder why there's no like domestic homes, for instance, here. We are looking into that very, very closely, of course. Still, for commercial operation, we have started with the low-hanging fruits, you could say. So the flexibility that can be used in the grid for a competitive price point. This is what has been the result in the past few years. So there are a few names here. Maybe some of them are also known, like names in the chemical industry here, or in the gas and airplane industry and so on. So international companies sometimes. And yeah, again, so this is for us just the starting point, but it is already significant enough to have in excess of a gigawatt of flexibility to be provided to the German grid. Yes. So, oops. This is just some first-hand view into the virtual power plant. You may know that we have 4 control zones, 4 TSOs, transmission system operators in Germany, and this is an example of demand to the virtual power plant arising in all these 4 zones simultaneously. So maybe something happened with outages or whatever, and the virtual power plant follows the TSO signals accordingly. Okay, so one final remark. What do we need in order to really get this flexibility on the ground? What I claim is, or what Entelios claims is, that what's necessary is a proper legal framework, including the distribution grid. So I have talked about the transmission grid so far. You might imagine that some of these loads, they are actually connected to the transmission grid, but most of them are still, even though they are large customers, connected to the distribution grid. And we would like to see a regulatory framework that allows us to make use of this asset of having widespread distributed resources and really use them to cure grid issues also on the lower voltage levels. We don't want to claim subsidies for our business, but we want products that are eligible both for the demand side and for the generation side equally. And we think that the prices should be the driving factor to ensure the proper allocation of the flexibility. So this, in the end, we think would allow successful demand response participation. We think that some accomplishments have already been done, and we think this is by far not the end of the way. Okay. No? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry, I'm done, yeah. I just wanted to show that, yeah.
Green. She's the co-founder and chair of Power Ledger. And if you look at her CV, you really find that she's been working in all the fields with the really impressive keywords like blockchain, peer-to-peer, virtual power plants. You can really find it all. So we're excited to have you here. And she will talk about actually what can technology do to enable consumers and prosumers actually to be remunerated for the flexibility they provide. And I think the great thing is you don't have slides, so there will be no technical problems whatsoever. Thanks.
I've lost my voice. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Ross, hi. I think that Power Ledger is a brand that some people know about in Australia, but a lot of people scratch their heads and go, why do you need blockchain? And I think it's a really good question to kind of start off with. You don't need a blockchain to do a lot of peer-to-peer trading. It's possible to do it without. But where it becomes powerful is if you want to facilitate cross-retailer trading of electricity peer-to-peer. And what the blockchain can do is facilitate consumers with different retailers being able to transact with each other and settle at the same time. And I agree with the sentiment that the price signal is important, but I don't think that's the only important thing in a market. The user experience is important, and also the settlement process. So you can have a great price, but you might not get paid for 3 months, and that is going to make a difference as to whether you sign up to do something as well. And what the blockchain can do is facilitate real-time trading and settlement. And we know that customers are more predisposed to try something if the user experience is simple. It's not a whole lot of things that they have to do to get on board, firstly. And the second thing is that there's a good price. And the third thing is that they can get paid quickly. And in terms of the flexible market, peer-to-peer trading is obviously when the sun's shining, you can trade surplus solar with your neighbour. But our conception of a virtual power plant is really looking at dispatch of electricity from batteries, curtailment, so demand response, and just general orchestration. And at the moment, consumers, and I mean both, commercial and industrial customers and residential customers are, locked out of the market. They're just price takers. But I think what the blockchain can provide in this case is their ability to participate in this market and to add more sophistication to the FCAS market, so frequency control and ancillary services, and also more supply in the peak instances. So as an example, households with batteries are able to dispatch electricity in the peak to their retailer and provide an alternative hedging product for retail electricity companies. And for some of the companies that we've been talking about in Australia, tier 2 retailers, I would call the new guard, are looking at providing between 50 to 100% of the spot price to customers dispatching battery-sourced electricity. And what that means is the household will pay back their battery very quickly. In places like South Australia or Victoria, where the government's offering battery subsidies sub 5 years. And that is a very interesting proposition for households, and to know that their battery will be called upon and they'll be paid for each and every instance that their battery dispatches electricity will encourage them to keep the battery full, but importantly, provide the price signal so that they size their battery not just to self-supply, but to optimise for that economic opportunity. So instead of putting a 5 kilowatt hour battery in, they're more likely to put a 15 kilowatt hour battery in. And so I think what the blockchain can do is provide a marketplace that will change the type of physical electricity system that we end up with. And so it's a reconception of how an electricity market could be, whereas for the past century it's been the physical market built as it is, and then the market that sits on top of it. And our view of energy is that there can be a level of sophistication provided with these technologies and platforms and marketplaces which will change the way the physical energy system is what it looks like longer term. And that's important, I think, because you want to create a price signal to keep people connected to the overarching system. Otherwise, they're incentivised just to go down the self-supply route, and although the likelihood of total grid defection is limited, there will be examples of that, and it will have an impact in terms of network costs. And we know in Australia network costs are a very significant part of the overall cost proposition. And so I think that if we can look at pricing the network in a discrete way, in a similar way to what happened around 1993 with the internet, where anyone with like a $500 Cisco router could set up and become an internet service provider in the US, and thousands of companies were born overnight as a result of this. And there was consolidation in the market to the big ISPs that we know today. But the discrete access for use of that network is something that I think could be analogous to electricity markets as we move towards distributed energy resources and the markets that will underpin them. And interestingly, the country that I've seen the most progress on this front is Thailand. The government signalled its intention to digitalise the electricity market, and they just announced last week 34 regulatory sandboxes to look at different models for trading of electricity, and they will inform the writing of the new rules that will underpin this system. But I mean, I think a lot of talk happens in Australia about grid stability, but I heard in one of the earlier talks, Germany has the highest penetration of renewables and also the most stable system. And so I don't think that's an assertion of a kind of issue here, but I think that the bigger problem we have here in Australia is about the price of electricity. And a lot of research has been done about, if we can just educate consumers a bit more, then they'll know to change tariffs, or they'll know to move to a different retailer when their 12-month deal is up. But research that was recently published by Bruce Mountain in analysing 50,000 bills showed that actually it didn't make very much difference. There's plenty of different tariffs out there, and they all end up in the same place economically speaking for the consumer. And the idea with the blockchain is that it kind of doesn't really matter what retailer you're with. If the retailer allows you to access the market opportunities that exist and passes on economic return for the contribution that you make to them or other players in the market. So it's kind of, it doesn't mean that the customer needs to go through that friction of changing retailers, and even though it's not as painful as changing your mortgage, there's still, there's a barrier to entry, and we want to automate this and make it as painless as possible. So that's the kind of just sort of some context setting in terms of why the blockchain and what's possible. We're only a young company, 3.5 years old, And we have projects in about 6 countries right now. Most of them are small. So we have one in Japan. We just completed a virtual power plant trial there with KEPCO. We've got one in Bangkok with BCPG, who are listed there with about 496 megawatts in their portfolio. And we've got a 1 megawatt trial with them in Bangkok. And we've got a project in Austria with Energy Steiermark, peer-to-peer trading, just 10 customers at this stage. And then in the US, we're using our technology for the trading of renewable energy certificates and other environmental commodities. And that will go live in November with about 20 megawatts of installed capacity trading associated RECs. And then we've got some small projects in Australia, apartment buildings with solar and batteries in Fremantle, and also a peer-to-peer trading trial across the grid in Fremantle with Synergy and Western Power. So just to kind of give you an idea of the projects that we've done to date. But if you look at the inflection point, I think that we're starting to see scale happening with peer-to-peer, but the bigger and more exciting work, I think, is around the virtual power plant, which is speaking to the comments around flexibility. And so on that note, I'll jump on the panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Gemma. So I wonder, is there a particular reason why there is not Germany in this list of projects, or are you working on that?
In terms of?
You didn't have any activities in Germany so far?
We would love one. That's why I came today, just to get a project.
I see. We'll see how this turns out. And then we have our final speaker, that is Nathan Dunn. I think that nicely connects to both your talk and the first one, actually. Nathan Dunn is the Managing Director for Australia and the Asia Pacific of Sonnengroup, which is actually a German company. Is it still a German company after it's been bought? I don't know.
Dutch.
German heritage.
German heritage company.
Let's not talk about the parent. It's German heritage.
Okay, and obviously that's one of the leading PV battery storage companies, and they also are kind of pioneers with shared energy, community energy projects, and actually trying to link these distributed resources. And we're happy to hear about you, about that from you. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Also, no slides. So a story, and I'm realising that my story is going to be a lot shorter than it was going to be originally. But think back about 11 years, 2 Bavarian gentlemen, ex-friends, or not ex-friends, friends and ex-colleagues, sitting together in a room and pondering, having worked in the renewable energy space, pondering why households should actually feed energy back into the grid in the middle of the day when they're not home. And so they came up with this kernel of thought, let's affect some change here, and let's develop a system that enables that household to absorb that energy into a battery and utilise it later on when maybe the electricity prices are a little bit higher. So Christoph Ostermann, Thorsten Steinhofer started the Sonnen business almost 10 years ago now, and the whole proposition was around using a piece of hardware to take the generation in the middle of the day, store it into a battery, and use it later on for the family to get a smooth amount of energy throughout the day without having to spend any more money. As the business progressed, so the first lot of units went out, 4 to 6 kilowatt hours worth of energy storage, very expensive devices. I think from memory, or from what I've been told, 23,000 euros for a 4 kilowatt hour device. Horrendously expensive, but early adopters took it up and started to prove the point that this was a great opportunity to help consumers maximise the energy asset that they had on their rooftop. The hardware started to develop a lot faster. We put electrical and design engineers behind making sure that the device was going to maximise the energy that it was storing, increase the capacity, and enable the customer to use the device in a lot of different ways. And so the 2 founders sat together and said, okay, this is great, it's actually helping the consumers, but what if we added some additional functionality from a software perspective? And this is where the business of Sonnen has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years, and moreover in the last 5 years. As we started to develop greater understanding of how the software within our system can actually help the consumers, we started to not only think about how the software can help charge, discharge and maximise the benefit of the energy storage stored in the device, but how the software that we were developing could actually start to help smooth out grid fluctuations. And I thank Herr Gama for giving away the punchline of my story. But we've developed a business and a proposition within our business where we're not only just a hardware provider now, we're a provider of services to these consumers. So we're giving the end consumer the opportunity to buy into a flat rate energy plan. That flat rate energy plan enables them to maximise the utilisation of their energy storage device, but it gives us access to some of that stored energy to help from a grid services perspective and to also help from a trading perspective. Herr Gama talked about the fact that there is the Sonnen community. Sonnen community in Australia is small but building. And it is a very similar proposition down here. So we've transplanted the smarts and technology from our German parent into the Australian environment where if an Australian consumer with a Sonnen battery buys into our Sonnen flat community, they have the opportunity to, well not opportunity, they actually get a flat rate energy tariff on a monthly basis, no bill shock. And that gives us access to maximise the benefit of their battery. It also gives them the ability to maximise the benefit of their battery. So there are, and I think I'll tie it back to the topic, there are flexibility options out there that will help not only from a consumer perspective, but from a grid perspective. I think the biggest challenge in a good proportion of the residential distributed flexibility options is the fact that we've got consumers in the mix, and consumers at this point in time have to be convinced, and that's no easy feat, but there are plenty of opportunities, just lots of barriers that we've got to break down over time. Cool.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So before we open this up to questions from the floor, I would like to ask one question myself. In the very first talk by Paul, we heard that actually, or you phrased it this way, in the future there will be limits to transmission expansion because of acceptance problems. Already they are here today, but in the future even more so. And maybe the activation of distributed flexibility options would be then mitigating these problems and would be a solution. But when I look at the social science literature and grey literature that is out there, we see that people may be reluctant actually to provide this flexibility, because when you look at what is the motivation of many people for going decentral is that they want to take the energy supply in their own hands. And I know several studies saying people would be reluctant going back to some utility and giving them control over, for example, their batteries. So we heard probably one strategy would be via blockchain, having a user experience that actually helps people to get involved. Or another one could be prices. So I would like to ask all of you, what do you think about this aspect?
Maybe let me first just add that it is not only for future limitations on further grid extension after, say, 2030 that we need these flexibility options, also from the perspective of a TSO, but we will have no power stations in place there for all the services we need, and so it's extremely necessary that we explore other possibilities using the power sources we then have. Yeah, so that's not only because of grid expansion or lack of grid expansion, but also because of the change of the entire production system. Yeah, so that's another very, very important reason why we explore these opportunities. Of course, we are not in direct contact with customers, except last week. That was very nice, visiting a family in their house, yeah, together with Sonnen, and visiting the battery, and really hearing from the family that it is very easy. And I think that's really the point, and the success of this business model, and the success of technologies like like blockchain, and that we experience also in the Netherlands, where we have a project with Tesla and also blockchain. It's very easy. The customers, they simply get some 200,000 bucks, some 200 bucks, and they have to care about nothing at all. They have their vehicle in the morning nicely charged, and so I think that's very important and so interesting to hear that.
I imagine if you can afford a Tesla, you don't care about 200 bucks at all.
Yeah, that's not really the case.
But who else wants to contribute on that? Do you want to say something, Gemma?
Well, I think that if you look at the virtual power plant trials that are going on in Australia, some of them are providing customers like a fixed payment every 2 months in arrears, and it's regardless of how much their battery is accessed or whether it's full. And I think that is not really the way the market, the value is going to be transferred from, you know, the buyer to the consumer. I think it'll be based on the amount of dispatching that occurs. So if you've got a 10 kilowatt hour battery and it goes to the actual maximum on the national electricity market, $14,500 megawatt hour, that's $14.50 a kilowatt hour, and that might happen 8 or 10 times a year. You would, if on a particular day, if that occurred and your battery was dispatched in that period and you got half as much as that, you would get $77 on that same day using the blockchain versus, perhaps a fixed payment every 2 months paid in arrears by 2 months. And so I think the user experience and what that does to both them knowing, hey, there's going to be an interval tomorrow where I could make a lot of money. Should I go to a restaurant tonight and use that to fund the experience, or put a bigger battery in, or connect my EV up to the extent that that's a possible thing. But I think that when the customer knows that these opportunities are available to them, they will change the purchasing decision around the asset, and then they'll sign up to things that actually give them the most control over their asset, and that remunerate them most in the biggest sense of the word, rather than give them a kind of watered down version of the real value. Because I think that consumers are a bit sick and tired of that, and that's kind of the whole point of why we're seeing so much, by way of installation of rooftop solar and batteries. And the thing at the moment, if you talk to most, I want a battery, but it's not quite there yet. And I think the Sonnen battery is really fabulous because it actually it has the capability within it from a demand response perspective to allow the full utilisation of that battery economically speaking. And that I think is going to, when we talk about a lot about empowering consumers in Australia, but what it looks to me like is they only want to empower consumers to the extent that it provides value to the incumbent players. And so it's kind of, not really in the bigger sense of the word empowering consumers yet. But I noticed that the AEMC, the Electricity Market Commission, announced that C&I customers, commercial and industrial customers, will be able to play in the VPP market. And in 12 months, they're going to review the ability for retail customers to do that as well. But I think that that's where you'll see a bigger wave of opportunity exist, because they'll be able to pay the battery back faster, and it'll be, at the moment that they're like, oh, the payback period is the life of the asset, and it needs to come down probably below 7 years in my view, because people will change houses every 7 years, and that's a kind of factor in their minds. So I think the user experience is part of it, the economic opportunity is part of it, and then the frequency of payment.
Okay. So if you come to Germany with a business model, changing houses every 7 years will not be an issue, I guess. We are one-time house buyers, if at all. So did you want to add up on that one, or?
I have 2 Sonnen zealots on the panel. I'm quite happy. I'll just sit back and let them talk.
Okay.
So in Germany, the costs we have for redispatching measures and congestion management measures on the transmission and distribution grid combined is in excess of €1 billion a year, like 2 billion Australian dollars a year, which sounds like an enormous number. On the other hand, you might argue that the energy used for this redispatch, like these redispatch measures, they are not extremely expensive. The power from these power plants being used to mitigate north-south congestions, for instance, we have, because of excess wind power, for instance, they are not extremely expensive. And it is probably, in our opinion, not the most meaningful thing to do to activate the demand side where it is very expensive, maybe, to try and get, or like to try and phase them in deliberately while simply adding cost to the system. On the other hand, we think that there is indeed demand-side flexibility, may it be on the residential side, maybe, yeah, maybe also on the industrial side, where it is possible to provide this flexibility for at least the price point, or even a lower price point than the conventional resources. But this is only possible, and this is the important point, I think, if there's a level playing field. So if there's a level playing field when it comes to the levies, taxes, grid tariffs, if there's a fair competition between the generation and the demand side. So, and this is of course a complicated thing, and someone needs to pay for the grid, obviously, and needs to pay all the taxes to get the money into the system. But we really need to think about a smart market design to bring the costs on the same level on the generation and the demand side for flexibility use.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think it's now high time to go to the floor and ask people questions. I see two. Let's probably start here and then move over there. Yes.
Thank you. Tristan Edis, Green Energy Markets. My question's, one of the things that we've grappled with in Australia, and I don't think we've really resolved effectively, I'd be interested in the German experience, is that essentially demand side responses to meet our electricity needs are in competition with transmission, but transmission is generally decided from a top-down planner perspective. And have you done anything in Germany to try and manage that conflict between a planner who perhaps maybe doesn't have very good understanding of what the demand side resources might be, and because there is no market signal there for people to essentially illustrate their interest, then it's hard for them to see it, how you've grappled with that challenge, because you're obviously building out plenty of transmission, and that's obviously costing you a lot of money, but at the same time, perhaps there's the use of a demand side opportunity there. So I'd be interested in whether you've grappled with that problem at all, or you've just gone, bugger it, let's just build lots of transmission and not worry about it.
You want to take that?
Yeah. I don't know if you point at building additional transmission grids. Of course, that's a rather central process. But the projects I try to illustrate in my presentation, that is really the attempt and the successful attempt to really listen to distributed sources, and that's possible via technologies not only like blockchain, but we have other control technologies where we cooperate also with DSOs, and also there we make use of other devices like pumps, electricity pumps in the houses. That's with the Bavarian DSO, and so that works. So we can really cooperate as a transmission system operator without still having intelligent meters at the moment. Yeah, that's still another story in Germany to get smart meters really on the way. We haven't succeeded yet to do so, but it's not necessary. We can cooperate together with DSOs, together with companies like Sonnen, to get really hundreds or thousands of distributed generation to help us stabilizing the system with control power. That's possible, but planning the transmission system is really something which is also, of course, done in cooperation with the DSOs. So we are not making a plan on our own, but it's discussed in a proper way, also with DSOs and with many other market players, in fact. So that's a really huge process which takes a couple of months with more than one really open discussion and lots of internet instruments to facilitate an open discussion. So, but it's still a rather central planning process when it comes to grid extension.
I think, Tristan, therein lies the big difference, right? There is a degree of cooperation that happens in Germany, and the DNSPs see distributed assets in Australia as a barnacle or something to push off because it's a bit of a challenge to them. If there was more cooperation, then I think the cooperation and collaboration of both sides of the industry would actually make it work.
Okay, I think the next one was Dylan over there.
Yeah, thanks, Wolf. I had a question for Benedict. First, I'd have to say I really like the idea of pumped wood pulp energy storage. It's very, very interesting. So in Australia, we're currently in the process of developing a fairly, I think it's fair to say, well, contentious wholesale demand response mechanism, or at least it has been a little bit contentious. And in that, that's essentially a second market or an additional market that overlays our energy-only market. I'd be interested to hear what the German experience is, or what you, I guess, mean by having a level playing field, or where you see the demand side, or how you see the demand side integrating into a system from a German perspective.
Okay. Yeah. Very good question.
You want to take it?
Yeah, sure. I think it was for me, right? Yeah. So it was already quite a long way. When we started operation in 2013, there were a few barriers in the way that were over time overcome for demand response on the transmission level to provide ancillary services. So to deliver the service I just described. That said, there is of course a bunch of opportunities technically possible for these demand response assets to really engage in the market. We would like to use more demand response on the distribution level. I think I tried to make that clear. For instance, to increase the amount of renewables the grid can absorb by physically letting excess renewables flow into these loads, for instance. We find that current regulation is maybe not yet fit for this. And this is, I think, we shouldn't blame the regulator too much. This is a thing that is evolving over time, and mistakes should of course be avoided. It is very easy to turn some screws and then mess up the entire system. This should be avoided at all costs, and we should be careful enough. On the other hand, of course, we see the potential there, and we do hope that like incremental measures will lead us to the level playing field for further parts of the industry, for further use cases. And for parts, to answer your question, we are already there. So when it comes to industrial customers that are sometimes eligible to very significant exemptions to grid levies, these customers can indeed compete with generation resources for ancillary services. And for other use cases, for other parts of the industry, we would try to get there.
I think we could have a lively discussion if that is then really a level playing field. But the next question was here, and then it's your turn.
Okay, great. Rachel Perry, Department of Environment and Energy. Just a question for our German panelists. The Australian experience with consumer data has been a little bit mixed. We have a consumer data right that is currently before Parliament, which will give consumers access to their own energy data, which would encourage retail switching. We've had mixed experiences with consumers on smart meters and rollout, and again, a somewhat healthy skepticism around remote access to consumers' appliances through demand response. Just wondering what the German experience has been around consumer access, or access to consumers' data. Any privacy concerns, any success stories, any issues there that you'd like to share with us?
Well, we don't really have access to individual consumers, yeah, as a TSO, of course. But of course, also we know that it is a touchy issue in Germany, and I alluded to the fact that we still not managed to introduce smart meters as of now because of the high security conditions in terms of data protection we imposed on the technology. Not enough producers and also the authority which is responsible for that, they were not able up to now to produce at least three different models which fulfill all the conditions, and so they are still not on the market, and it's a really long-lasting process. We still don't have smart meters in the market, I think, but it will come in a couple of months. Yeah, it's a touchy issue, but we also, and that's our experience, for instance, with Sonnen. We also experienced if you tell a story to the consumer that he can profit by controlling his device, and also the environment can profit, then it's really no problem at all to get these people into what community whatsoever. And so maybe that's the way forward, rather than to impose really huge conditions on these appliances, which can hardly be met by any company producing these appliances.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That if you'll facilitate citizen utilities and citizen power stations, if you provide them with an economic opportunity, and they'll make the trade-off in their mind about doing that.
Okay, then we have, do you want to add? Then we have another question.
Excellent. Gabrielle Satori from Hydromine. So just for everybody to know, before I joined Hydromine, I used to work a lot in energy efficiency and energy productivity, similar to Ellen. And so I have a question for Gemma, and I think this Power Ledger is a really quite exciting sort of technology or company. What you do. Yes, I just have a question. Blockchain, I think we all know, is a very energy-hungry technology. So can you actually tell us a little bit about the efficiency, and also who's actually paying for it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one of the biggest urban myths about blockchain. There are different types of blockchains: proof of work, proof of authority, consortium chains, and the proof of work chain, and the most famous one, Bitcoin, is certainly very energy hungry, but that is just a very small percentage of the types of blockchains that are available on the market, and I don't think that's the kind of fundamental challenge in terms of scale. There's so much innovation happening in terms of blockchains that can be used for super fast block time, so writing lots of data frequently to the chain and doing that in a very low energy fashion. So I think that you'll have consortium chains and proof of authority chains that already exist in the market that can deliver that.
Who's paying for it?
Well, it's the same way when two counterparties transact with each other. They usually use, internal record-keeping systems, clouds, or their own servers on site, and the blockchain is no different. So it's really about looking at how much replicability that you need in the blockchain to provide the stability. And it may be, for example, that In the context of electricity, you have the consortium is the market participants that are providing a node on the chain, and it's really no different to every counterparty having their own record, which is using a certain amount of electricity inside their organisation.
I'm not sure, was there another question somewhere here in the middle? One over there. So maybe that's the last one before we go to lunch.
Hi, I'm a colleague of Gabrielle's. I'm the chairman of Hydromine. Hydromine's a company that's building pumped hydro in abandoned surface and underground mines. I'm a farmer and a miner of many decades, and I'd like to put a bit of a sombre bent on this conference, and it's about why we're here. We're here to try and reduce the impact on our climate, supposedly by a pollution called carbon from burning fossil fuels. And there's a lot of talk, this morning, this afternoon, and tomorrow there will be about batteries, about brown hydrogen, green hydrogen. A bit about blockchain, more than happy to discuss that and explain actually what it is and why it's different to cryptocurrencies. It's just a counting method. But batteries, it's copper, zinc, lead, nickel, cobalt, lithium and graphite. Very toxic metals when they're mined, very expensive to mine, and they'll end up getting thrown in the bin just like e-waste is. Brown coal hydrogen, you burn 200 tonne of brown coal with 200 tonne of air to produce 200 tonne of carbon dioxide and 1 tonne of hydrogen. And it's very easy to gloss over the fact that that carbon dioxide has to go somewhere. Green hydrogen, supposedly using renewable energy to split water. Where's the water coming from? It's not going to be fresh water. We have no fresh water. It's coming from desalinated salt water. What about the salt? So it's very nice to talk about all these wonderful things and starry-eyed and nice graphs, but what we're doing is we're looking at new technologies that have very strong unintended consequences in their own unsustainable pollution. Okay?
I think
so, now I'm going to try and promote our company. On that basis, okay, you've got to think about the things that we're glossing over here. We're glossing over creating new pollutions that we do not have solutions for. I'd also like to draw your attention to probably the first presentation that showed the cost of electricity in Germany and the cost of electricity in Australia. And a full half of the cost of electricity in Germany was for tariffs and green credits. That cost is the cost of implementing renewables. That cost comes to the union members' pockets that are in this room, who noted before that the politicians in Australia, unlike Germany, are poles apart, and why won't they get together?
May I interrupt? It would be
so the question is, how do we deal with the pollution that's emanating from all these technologies that are required to transition from this grid?
Thank you. Vince, do you want to?
Well, I think there's a lot of technologies that will come and adapt to do it. So I think you can't say which is good and which is bad pollution per se. So we absolutely know that CO2 emissions are creating vast problems for the world as a whole. And it's as Ross said, I don't know where Ross is now, but it's a wicked problem for us to resolve, and we're causing significant damage to the whole economy. So which do you balance up? Now, as an economist, I usually like to say, get the prices right and the choices will come out. And once you fully incorporate the waste costs into these production facilities, just as we're not currently incorporating the waste cost of CO2 into the atmosphere, where we've got effective subsidies on two different types of technology. So the answer for me as an economist would be to try and put a price that encompasses the full life cycle cost of your technology. And so then, as we've said in a number of occasions, once the price is transparent, consumers will make choices that are consistent. So Adam Smith's invisible hand will come and solve the problem for us.
So yes, economists love internalization. That's right. So I think we should wrap it up. So I really would like to thank all the speakers for their insights. And we've learned there is technology ready, there are a lot of opportunities, and we need to find this level playing field. And actually, maybe we can explore a bit of this, how to get there in the regulatory setting in the next session after the lunch break. So thank you. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Sorry, a little loud. And I won't hold you back from lunch. It's been a great morning, but a long morning. There's just one other thing that Malta is going to talk to. I wanted to draw your attention to a bunch of work that the Energy Transition Hub has released today to summarise some of the research that's gone on in the last 2 years, much of which we're talking about we collectively are talking about the topics that we've been looking at in the research today. You'll see these lying around, and that is what they are. They're summary reports that draw your attention to a whole variety of work that's been going on, including in relation to the power system and transition generally, policies, scenario modelling, including 200% renewable scenarios for Australia, export opportunities, including in relation to hydrogen, and the green one relates to carbon dioxide removal, which we're not focusing on here at this conference. Anyway, Malta has something very quickly to draw your attention to before we let you get lunch.
Thank you. You can even take your places. It's nice that Rebecca introduces herself as not keeping you away for lunch and keeping you away from lunch, and now I do. Paul Gergama already suspected that here our transmission grid line problems are there to highlight the importance of transmission grids. No, that's not the reason. The real reason is, and now this is a quiz for the Germans, what happened on 28th of September 2016? The South Australian blackout. So a blackout in South Australia. Now, 3 years later, we thought, why don't we create a blackout in a brown coal-powered state like Victoria? So these screens are flickering, and we watch your Twitter accounts, whether in the end the brown coal power plants in the La Trobe Valley are going to be blamed for our screens. So we are going to now introduce for the next 1.5 days a little bit also of an additional interactive feature. So if you could get your phones out or your computers and then go to this website, polif.com, Climate College. That would be fantastic, because we would like to get about some questions that arise over the next 1.5 days, also your opinion in the room. And so we start out, once you type that address into your mobile phones, so again, polif.com Climate College, we start out with the first quiz. And now the first slide is, you see it on the side monitors actually. What has been the maximum weekly contribution of renewably sourced electricity in South Australia in 2019? So we are looking not for the average over this year, we're looking for the week that had the highest renewable energy contribution in which the lights didn't go out. So please make your guess. And we'll see here there are a few in the top number range. You see that on the side monitors. Most of you suspect at the moment the 86% being the correct. Yeah, 70% is kicking up, and it's coming closer, it's coming closer. Yes, it's coming closer. And is the horse race already finished? We are here in the Melbourne, in the city of horse races. Oh, there is another overtaker. Yes, and now we have potentially a new winner now. The resolution is, next slide. It was 76.5%. So the second highest option, which is the third horse here in the race, if I see correctly. So we had here in April this year, we had a week with 76.5% of average renewable electricity contribution to the South Australian grid. Now, just so that we get used to the interactive feature, let's do the same in Germany. Whole of Germany, what was the week in 2019 and how much renewably sourced electricity was there pumped into the German grid as a whole, not by any state, as a whole. You have here the options.
Generation or consumption?
Generation. Again, the bottom horse, it's a very similar picture. The bottom horse took off in the beginning, and now the third horse from the lower end is closing in, Does it make it? Does it make it? Maybe. And the two third and fourth contenders? No, but the horse in the maximum range, yeah, be closely. Okay. That is almost a tie between 65 and I assume 85%. And the resolution is? It was 65% in a March week of this year. So now you know the interactive feature. That is fantastic. In the lunch break, which you are going to enjoy over there where you had your coffee break, we are going to have an open question to you. What are the opportunities, the unforeseen, the unpredicted opportunities of the energy transition? That can be to consumers, that can be to export industries, that can be to the soft power of a country, etc. It can be some smaller items. So please, in the next question that you see here on the screen, the unforeseen opportunities, lunch is your first option, but you have time over the next 45 minutes over lunch to joggle down some ideas, and then we all welcome you back here in 1 hour with a session on market design with a set of eminent speakers, and we are looking forward to an exciting afternoon with you.